But let's start off with that theory in practice, different types of supervision, Rory.
Yes, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And well, I think it's an interesting one because when I first started counselling, I never come across the term supervision. I came from a commercial background and I really never heard that term, or I'd never really taken any time to think about it. And of course, when I was doing my studies, supervision was kind of put over to me and the other students as clinical supervision, where you took your client work and you saw an external supervisor and you were accountable for your work and you gained support in your work. And, I think a lot of therapists would think that was what supervision is. But when I moved in and worked in the sort of social environment in the third sector, I soon realized that supervision was a catch-all term for if you like, accountability. And there are different types of supervision. And I can remember, taking my first job as a support worker and going to supervision. And I was really surprised that it was absolutely nothing like my clinical supervision for my counselling. It was managerial supervision, where it was about holidays and targets and performance and key performance indicators and all that type of thing. And I think it's useful for anybody who's coming into the profession and certainly looks to maybe getting work in the profession to understand that supervision is a catch-all term, and there are different types of supervision. So, we've talked about clinical supervision. We've talked about managerial supervision, where you see a manager and they talk about holidays, performance, client loads, that type of thing. And then you have group supervision, where you may want to meet up as a group and be supervised in a group of your peers. And then, interestingly enough, Ken, we have specialist supervision, where you may have a specific discipline. And I'm thinking of eye movement desensitization and reprogramming. I can never get the initials right, Yes, thank you, Ken.
No worries.
Jumble about in my dyslexic head. And I supervise a supervisee who comes to me for general practice, but has another supervisor for her EMDR practice because it's a specific discipline. So I think it's useful just to kind of explore the different forms of supervision and realize that there's just more than one.
There is, yes. And it's a really interesting topic because there is another flavor of supervision as well, and that's the own internal supervisor. We've spoken about that in podcasts before, where we kind of helicopter above the practice that's going on in the present moment within the room, and we're kind of aware of the ethics and what the client is bringing and the contract that we have with that client. So we're kind of not just there with them, we're also kind of helicoptering in self-supervisor as it is called. I think it's interesting because if we look at the different kinds of supervision, you'll notice that they're there for very different reasons. So your managerial supervision is about the running of the organization, the measuring of what is working, what is not working, team working, clinical practice. That's what's going to be covered. Now, you may take elements of that into your own supervision as well. Now, the difference might be if you had a frustration with the organization that you worked within, maybe you'd be taking that to your clinical supervisor, and part of self-care kind of having somewhere where you can speak about that and look with a peer at how you might approach that. The other thing that you mentioned, Rory, in terms of different types of supervision, and I think this is really important, is those specialist areas. In February of 2001, one of the ethical organizations in the United Kingdom, it's called the BACP, or the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, they introduced a new framework for supervisors, an ethical framework that supervisors should work to. And they've clearly distinguished specialist competences within that framework for supervisors. And if you're working in a certain area, then you should be seeing a supervisor who has the competences in that area. You used EDMR, Rory, in your example there. You didn't train in EDMR, so you're not there and able to supervise. But there are some hidden potholes within that as well. Specifically right now, there's a massive turn to online working. This came from a pandemic causing us to need to go and do that. The ethical framework requires that you should have training in working online to be able to work online. But it also now suggests that if you go to a supervisor, that supervisor should have the competencies to, and they are specialist competencies laid out in the framework, to be able to assist you with your online working, because it's very, very different. It might not feel different. And that, I think, can be a slippery area where you think, oh, well, I'm looking for a supervisor and I don't mind if I meet them online, and I've got a few online clients, and just picking a supervisor without asking those questions about those specialist competencies that they need to hold.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because since 2019, the online world has expanded. It's just exploded. It's blown up. And as such, there was a lot of people initially who came on to online work unsure of, what the differences are. And that can range from the technology you use right across to the specific psychological processes that can manifest themselves when working online. So ethical bodies, all ethical bodies under the Professional Standards Authority, where ethical bodies sit now, they sit under the Professional Standards Authority. All the ethical bodies suggested that practitioners do some online training, and supervisors, should be trained if they're working with people who are working online to be able to understand that, because you need to understand that the totality of someone's practice. And I want to say something about specialisms. There are areas of more technical counselling, and I'm thinking of our colleagues in maybe the transactional analysis world who'd apply specific theories to work with clients within a contracting environment, such as script analysis, or working in the Cartman drama triangle, or contracting for staying in the adult. And if someone's working as a TA therapist, a trained TA therapist, the supervision should match that, so that the therapist has a really good understanding of how these. And I use the word technical. I think it's a pretty good use of words to how it's applied. How are you applying script analysis, and what's happening? And is there, have you got script rebound, which is something that sometimes happens in transactional analysis, where someone pushes back against trying to change their life script. So I think it's really important that when you, and I think this comes down, Ken, to one of my biggest gripes, is that therapists should be free to choose their clinical supervisor.
Oh, yeah.
I've always said this when I was taught, 2 decades ago, the emphasis on find yourself a supervisor that works for you. As we'd say to clients, find a therapist that fits with you. Because if you're working with a supervisor and you feel inhibited, or you feel you can't bring the totality of your practice, ultimately that impacts on your client, because you cannot be the total of your practice within supervision.
100%. It is so important. And looking back just a few years, really, when you look to a practitioner who had a supervisor, generally they would have a supervisor.
Yes.
However, now it is not uncommon for a practitioner to have multiple supervisors, 2 supervisors, sometimes even more. And it's about taking those special competence areas to the person who holds those competences. I looked up as we were talking, Rory, the specialist areas that are identified. And this is just the BACP that I'm quoting here, based in the UK. And of course, you'd need to look to your ethical body or the ethical bodies that you have in your country or your area, or who you work to see what that looks like there. But the additional subject areas are working creatively, so creative working. And that's interesting, because I didn't train in creative working. And if I had a supervisee who came to me about creativity in their practice, I would struggle to be there, because I don't fully get it. I can maybe go partially down that road, but I can't go all the way down that road with them. Group supervision, that is a specialist area. If you are a supervisor, train as a supervisor, going straight into group supervision without additional CPD is not smart because it's different. It's like counseling and couples counseling or group counseling or family counseling. They differ. The techniques you will use will differ. The way that you manage the environment and hold the space differs. Online and phone supervision, which we've spoken about at the moment, supervising in an organizational context, which we've kind of touched on as well, but there are specialist areas that you would need to look into there. Supervising work with children and young adults, so important. You know, as a supervisor, if a supervisee approached me and they worked in a school, in a primary school, let's say, they would not be a good fit for me. However, they'd be a good fit for you, Rory, because you have studied in that area. Supervising trauma is another area. If you have a supervisee who is working in, call it the front line, where there is a lot of trauma in the work that they're doing, have you as a supervisor trained in that area? Supervising therapists working with interpreters. We spoke about interpreters in a very recent podcast, not that far back. I can't remember the episode, of 2 or 3 weeks ago. Go and have a look for it. Again, you know, it's a specialist training area in supervision. So different flavors to supervision, I guess, as counseling and psychotherapy matures into the world that we live in today, Rory.
Yes, I want to pick up on that point, Ken. Matures. When I started, I think on every podcast I say, when I started 2 decades ago, I need a bit of a stick, maybe. I went 2 decades ago. It was a cottage industry. It really was. It was good-hearted people who wanted to help others. There wasn't a huge amount of research or science around. And one supervisor covered everything. And now as we're understanding more about how human difficulty and you know, trauma is experienced by people, and the, you know, the, if you like, the physiological aspects of it, and the different disciplines within counselling. You mentioned children, you know, you might mention working with people who are non-English speakers, people of different cultures. We're now a more mature sort of body of people. You know, we're not the same people we were 20 years ago. This is an emerged profession now, and as such, we need to think very carefully about our supervision and the fact that it's a lot more granular than ever before. Just to pick up on your point, Ken, on group supervision. One of the things about group supervision, it should be used, I think, in tandem with your personal supervision, because in group supervision, what tends to happen is you work with people who may be from other disciplines and say, I've tried this intervention, or I'm using this intervention, or I'm thinking of this theory. And I think there's a danger that you think, oh, I'm going to try that. That sounds like a really good idea. I'm going to try that with my client. I would say, take that to your supervisor, your main supervisor, and say, I'm thinking of working, you know, I've been in group supervision. Someone's using, you know, this intervention. I'm thinking of using it. And I think as a supervisor, I'd say, well, how much do you know about it? You know, it's one thing talking about that in a group supervisory hour, but it's a whole different ballgame actually practicing it in front of a client. So I think the two things go hand in hand. I think group supervision can be very useful, but I also think there's a counterbalance where your personal supervision can kind of distill what you've learned in group supervision, and then you can think about maybe putting it on your CPD calendar, maybe gradually introducing a different intervention or a different approach to your client, and then working that through with your supervisor. It should be, I think, a gradual approach when you start to use different approaches. I know when I became a trauma-informed practitioner, I worked with my supervisor for a long time before I finally kind of distilled how I use that approach within my practice.
Yeah, you know, just to kind of put the final dot on the I, cross on the T on the group supervision, the ethical organizations kind of show you that dilution of group supervision. So an hour and a half supervision one-to-one with a supervisor, just you and the supervisor, whether that be online or face-to-face in a room, is different to if you were in a group supervision in terms of how many supervision hours you can claim. And of course, there is an ethical imperative that we do a certain amount of supervised hours for the clients that we're seeing and the hours that we're working. So it's worth keeping that in mind. And I agree with what you're saying, Rory. I've been in both. I've been in group supervision and, of course, in the room face-to-face supervision. It can be a really rich and rewarding environment in group supervision. The dynamics in group supervision can mean that members of that group are informing the supervision process and maybe putting in their own ideas and thoughts and feelings and feedback. But having that peer, having that person that you can go to with your clients on a regular basis where you build up that relationship, that's so important. Yeah. So there it is. There's supervision that we've got a handout, because even in supervision, it's interesting. You know, I work as a person-centered therapist. I worked as a person-centered therapist when I was practicing. I've stepped out now. And during that time, I had a number of different supervisors who had a core in person-centeredness, maybe some other elements in there as well. And they were all different in terms of how the supervision went. So every supervisor, I guess, brings themselves into that relationship in the same way as all person-centered counselors will be different for clients. You know, it's the core modality that underpins that. And then within your supervision, there are three main areas, and we've got a handout about this, and that's why I'm covering it here. There are three main areas that you should be receiving in supervision, no matter what the modality of that supervision. And that is formative. So that's the supervisor sharing their experience to teach the counselor. So in other words, informing your practice learning. You might be pointed to CPD on something that you bring in. So that is the formative. Normative, the supervisor asking the counselor to account for and justify their work. And then restorative, supervisor offering support if the counselor is struggling, either with an ethical dilemma, or maybe the counselor is struggling with an element of their own life, or maybe something that a client brought up that brought something up in you as the counselor. You take that to supervision, and that is in the restorative area. So different kinds of supervision is really interesting. I think it's so massive, isn't it, supervision, Rory?
It is. It's such a huge area. I'm becoming, I think, more specialist as we move in. And just to mention that handout, if you want that handout, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, which is our mother website, click the podcast tab, go to episode 253. That updated handout, because there's a lot of it has been rewritten to reflect the kind of more modern approach to supervision, is available for you. Episode 253, counsellingtutor.com. Press the podcast tab, and you'll be able to download that super duper handout and have it to kind of ponder on when you're thinking about supervision. Yes.
Counselling Tutor offer clinical supervision training, which kind of gives you the competences to work face to face in a room, but also to supervise online practice. If you're not a supervisor and you're interested, and you're mature in your practice, over 2 years of practice, member of an ethical body, working to an ethical framework, you can apply to join the next intake or get more information on our supervision training by going to counsellingtutor.com. And I'm also going to share that we have a brand new, about to release training program that is coming out. And this is for supervisors who have already trained to be supervisors. They're already proficient supervisors, but they haven't maybe done the competences that are required for supervising online practitioners. We will be offering that as a top up to your supervision training to give you a certificate to be able to have those competences or evidence those competences in line with the framework requirements. It's interesting as the world changes, Rory, as our profession matures. It's great to be part of it. I'm loving this journey.
Absolutely, Ken. And you know, as I said, we are a maturing profession now. You know, which is why when you work with colleagues in, you know, maybe social work or the medical world, they treat you as equals. You know, and I think that is due to the fact that, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, we've grown up. We stand alone as a profession in our own right, and that's a brilliant thing. We're a matured profession. We're not emerging anymore.